Alright, so this is probably my favorite thing to talk about around this time of the year, and that's the NFL draft. Now, when you talk about the NFL draft, you obviously have to talk about quarterbacks. No matter how strong or how weak the class is, quarterbacks always are getting talked about. Now, everybody seems to have their own list on who they think goes where, their rankings. This year's class is interesting because it's very top-heavy. Now, there's a lot of quarterbacks in this draft that people have their own opinion on as far as could be a star based on their potential. Now, everybody wants to say that they know who the next John Elway is, they know who the next Peyton Manning is. I'm going to give you my top 5, and number 1 and number 2 obviously are going to be Tua and Joe Burrow. Now, I have Joe Burrow number 1, but the question is, if Tua Tagovailoa is healthy, how close is that race for number 1? I personally think it would be very close because I do believe skill-wise, I believe they're very close as far as potential NFL fit. Joe Burrow this season, he had 5,671 yards. This was first in college football. 60 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. This is what makes him rated as high as he is. The season he had this year was like none other. Probably one of the best seasons a quarterback has had in college football. Joe Burrow, his ability is out of this world. And obviously that's why people love him. But one thing with these quarterbacks, and you've seen last year with Kyler Murray, is you can have great ability, but your size is always going to hurt you if you're not that prototypical size. Joe Burrow is. Joe Burrow is 6'4", 216 pounds. He's perfect. It's hard to find an exact flaw for Joe Burrow. Now, the cons that I have, there's one. And it's one that's not really talked about a lot because of the fact of how great of a season he did have. This gets overlooked. That con is the amount of playing time he's had at a high level. Keep in mind, he sat behind J.T. Barrett, Dwayne Haskins here at Ohio State. He ended up beating Dwayne Haskins for the backup role, and then he broke his hand, or his finger. This is what set him back. This is what ultimately made him transfer to LSU. So that's my only con with Joe Burrow. That's it. He hasn't played this well for a long time. He's one of these, people are going to say maybe he's a one-year wonder. I don't think you can be a one-year wonder doing what he did. He played at a high level consistently every single game. That's not just something that happens. That has to be real. Now, my number 2, Tua Tagovailoa. Obviously, Tua is, we already talked about with the injury history and whatnot. Tua is one of these guys that is really, really exciting to watch. Left-handed quarterbacks obviously aren't very common. But in today's college football, Tua's style is literally perfect for what you would want in an NFL or what you would want in a college quarterback. Now, to me, his best comparison is Russell Wilson based on style. I have been on the record saying I believe that Tua is a left-handed Russell Wilson. Tua's stats this year, 2,840 yards, 33 TDs, 3 interceptions. Keep in mind, Tua did get hurt at a point this season and was out for a while, so the stats might not look great based on his numbers, and they're not bad to begin with, but keep in mind he was out with an injury, and that is his main con. Now, his pros, when he's healthy, his ability is fantastic. His movability, fantastic. His accuracy, fantastic. His style, like I said, is very similar to Russell Wilson, except he's a lefty. His cons are obviously his injuries. Now, like I said, if he didn't have this injury history, he might be number 1 on a lot of boards. Like I said, I would strongly consider putting him number 1 based off of his style. And keep in mind, he did it for a longer period of time. So what we talk about with Joe Burrow, he didn't do it for a consistent amount of time. He did it for 1 year. Tua's the opposite. Tua did it for a long time at a high level. So he's number 2 only based on injury. If he didn't have this injury history, he might be number 1. Who knows? Now, my number 3 quarterback, this is where people start getting up in arms because everybody wants to talk about the prospects. Everybody wants to talk about the possibilities. To me, my number 3 quarterback is Justin Herbert. Now, before the combine, before talks started heating up, Justin Herbert was number 3 on a lot of people's boards, if not number 2. Well, he wasn't really number 2, but he was consistently in that number 3 spot. Now, Justin Herbert, to me, is one of the most exciting prospects as far as the NFL. This is the quarterback. I usually fall in love with one quarterback. This year, this is my guy, Justin Herbert. I think Herbert's getting overlooked because of the top-heavy class that this is. I do believe if you're going 3 tiers, I do believe it's Tua and Burrow number 1, Herbert's number 2, and the others are 3 and below. I truly believe that. Herbert does have his issues, though. This year's stats, 3,471 yards, 32 TDs, 6 interceptions. The numbers are not fantastic necessarily, but they're not bad. His pros, his size, his arm strength, and his movability. Now, Justin Herbert, we talk about prototypical NFL quarterbacks with their size. He is 6'6", 237 pounds. Now, you might fall in love with the size. That might not be great because throughout history, it's been proven that NFL quarterbacks are not great based off of their size. I mean, it's just a fact. Justin Herbert has some issues, but if you get a good quarterbacks coach, you can work on his mechanics, you can work on his consistency. I think he can turn out to be one of the best in this class. Now, he does need work. He's going to have to be in a good situation. I do think he's going to need a good offensive line, as all of these quarterbacks do, but I think him in particular will need a better offensive line than some of the others. But I do think if he can work out some of his mechanic issues, some of his footwork, this will help his consistency, and his accuracy is a little inconsistent at times, but I do think Justin Herbert is a top quarterback. I don't care what people say. I think he's great. I think he could potentially be great. Now, if he gets forced into a bad situation, then things can go south, but I do think he is going to be a top quarterback. Now, this is where people start to separate. Well, actually, they really separate at 3. I'm not going to say, necessarily, that there's a defiant 4 and 5. But I will say this. If you're going by me personally, my number 4 quarterback in this draft class is Jacob Eason. That's not popular. That's not something that a lot of people are going to agree with. That's me personally. I've watched Jacob Eason for a while. I've watched him a little bit at Georgia, now at Washington. I think he's a great quarterback. Now, Jacob Eason is 6'6", 227 pounds. He reminds me of Herbert. Like I said, size is almost identical. Eason, of course, transferred to Washington. This year's stats, 3,132 yards, 23 TDs, 8 interceptions. Big arm, big size. He seems like a good fit in the NFL as far as being that prototypical quarterback. And when I say that, I'm not saying you have to be a prototypical NFL quarterback to succeed, because like I said earlier, guys like Kyler Murray aren't necessarily prototypical, and they have succeeded so far. Now, his cons, his mechanics, his footwork, inconsistency at times. Very similar to Justin Herbert. Very similar. Now, Herbert, to me, is above Eason drastically, but I do think there is this potential there with Jacob Eason. Honestly, I think Jacob Eason's a first-round quarterback. I do. I think he's bottom of the first round, but depends, because quarterbacks are going to get reached for in this draft. And I do think there's a chance that 3 or 4 quarterbacks go in the top 10. people are going to fall in love with this class and start to reach, as they always do. I think Jacob Eason could be a really good quarterback in the NFL. I'm not saying that for a fact. Like I said, this is me speculating. But I do think, based on his ability, based on what I've seen, I think he needs some work. But same thing with Justin Herbert. If he can get in the right situation, I think he'd be great. Place that I would love to see him would be a place like Pittsburgh, to where he can maybe sit back for a year, a couple games, whatever, half the season, learn from a guy like Ben, come in, fill that role, step up, be a good quarterback. My number 5, and like I said, these would be close, and it's like I said earlier, a lot of people are going to disagree with this. A lot of people fell in love with this guy like you wouldn't believe. I personally think he's overrated. That's just me. Jordan Love. Jordan Love is 6'4", 225 pounds. Good size. This year's stats, 3,402 yards, 20 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. I think Jordan Love, like I said earlier, is overrated. Those interceptions in the conference that he's in scares me drastically. And I'm not saying you're not allowed to throw interceptions just because you play where he played at Utah State. But I do believe that that's something you got to look at, because if you look at quarterbacks coming out of college, you look at their interception problems, that usually translates. Now, keep in mind who he's playing with is not necessarily guys like Tua played with or guys like Burrow played with, but still, that's something you gotta keep an eye on because of how that is translated. His consistency is not great. When he does shine, he shines like a neon light, but his consistency needs some work. I do think that he's a good prospect as far as sit for 1 to 2 years behind a good quarterback in a good situation. Then I believe he could become a good quarterback. Some pros with him: arm strength, movability. He's a very good pro-style quarterback. I think his release, his throwing motion, everything is good. I like it. My main problem with him, I don't know how he's going to translate. Sometimes and that's the thing, a lot of people talk about with these Pac-12 quarterbacks, with these Big 12 quarterbacks, the defenses they're playing against is not that great. When they translate to the NFL, it doesn't always work sometimes. Guys have to ease into that. I see him going to a situation where they're going to say, hey, we want you to start immediately, and I can see it backfiring. I don't think it's going to work out that well. Like I said, I do believe he can potentially work out if he's in the right situation, but he's not a day one starter. He's after a year and a half starter. He needs work. I don't think that he's a day one guy. You can rate him high all you want. That is fine. He's not Patrick Mahomes. Stop saying that. Joe Burrow came out and said this in his NFL Combine interviews. Stop comparing me to the greatest quarterback of all time, talking about Tom Brady. Everybody wants to compare these quarterbacks. Everybody wants to put a name with a prospect as far as who they could become. You've seen this with Baker, with Brett Favre. Don't put that name over them. Let them become themselves. Let them develop. Let them learn. That's a big thing with Baker this year. Me personally, everybody fell into this. I fell into it. He didn't have much time to develop. Number 1 overall draft pick. Yes, you're supposed to come in and you're supposed to start day one. You should be able to if you're the number 1 pick. But when you're in a bad situation, you need to learn. You need to develop. College football is different from the NFL. I'm worried that a guy like Jordan Love is going to go to a situation, be forced into starting, and it's going to backfire. If he goes in the right situation, sure, he can be good. But I do think he's drastically overrated. I do think there's going to be a team that takes him way too early. I believe he could get taken over Justin Herbert. All of these quarterbacks do have their own problems, but I do believe they all could develop into a very, very good prospect, very good players, but they all need work at some point. Joe Burrow himself needs work. He's not going to be in a great situation in Cincinnati. Okay? We're going to judge these quarterbacks based off their first year. Give it time. Give it time. So, that's my thoughts on this NFL quarterback draft class. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. Tell me who your top 5 is. Tell me if I'm wrong. I'll see you in the next video.